unfold. What's joy is pain on the other hand. And what happens when the one that you love is the main cause of your suffering? I need you like I need air to breathe. I need you to save me from me.
When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man, that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man, that thou visitest him?
Please don't let me drown. Please don't let me drown.
He telleth the number of the stars. He calleth them all by their names. Great is our Lord, and of great power. His understanding is infinite.
Whoa.
To explore his world, man has always risked the unknown. Because it is unknown, and man's nature is to know.
But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace, of them that make peace. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and godhead. Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be. But we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the majesty on high. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Come now, and let us reason together, saith the Lord. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise.
Minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go!
Well, hello and welcome to Idol Killer, a ministry dedicated to destroying sacred cows for the cause of Christ. I'm your host, Warren McGrew, and for today's program, I'll be interviewing Dr. Alan Rhoda, academic librarian and Christian philosopher. He's earned dual master's degrees from the University of Bloomington. He's taught philosophy at various institutions such as the University of Notre Dame and University of Nevada. And the main focus of his research has been on the openness of the future, contrasted with the subtle nature of the past and present. He's published over a dozen papers exploring different ways the open view can be understood. And that's really why he's joining us to discuss a recent paper. It's called Retrospective and Prospective Problems of Evil, a comparative assessment of 4 models of divine providence. Dr. Rhoda, thank you so much for coming on the program, sir. It's a bit of a mouthful as far as the title goes, and I botched it, but I did my best. How are you doing, sir?
I am doing very well. Yeah, I appreciate your having me on the program.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's an interesting topic. The problem of evil is something that I think everyone, no matter what their particular theistic or atheistic worldview, has to address and account for. It's not just something unique for a particular version of theist. I think it's something we all have to wrestle with. And I think the open view is an interesting way of handling it. And I'm very curious to see how this paper of yours came to be and the contents of it as we share this with the audience. I'm sure they're equally excited here. But could you give us an idea, just a summary of what it means to have an open view, what it's entailed in that?
Well, I do explain this a little bit more as we get into the paper when I contrast the four models of divine providence. So just to be, I guess, brief now. In the paper, I do suggest that an open theistic view is arguably the best, at least of the four models of providence I consider, in handling the problem of evil in all of its different respects. That doesn't mean that open theists get a free pass on the problem by any stretch. It's a difficult problem for anyone, but all the different models run into problems at one point or another, and it's a kind of a matter of what kind of bullets you're prepared to bite, what problems you're willing to take on, which ones you're willing to, I don't know, I guess punt on.
Right.
But open theism is basically the idea that there is a God, one God, the standard kind of monotheism. God is all good, all powerful, knowing, etc. But that in deciding to create a world, that God decided to create a particular kind of world. He deliberately decided to create a world with an open-ended future, one that included lots and lots of free creatures that, to some extent, could choose their own course in life, and that God is working in, around, and through his creatures to achieve his ultimate goals for creation. But God wanted an open-ended world where the specific outcomes are, to some extent, well, up to us to decide. Kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure novel, right? Where there's many different ways things could go, and God's okay with that. That's how he wanted it to be. That contrasts with models of providence that say that from the beginning God had a meticulous, a fully specific plan for all of creation history, and God ordained, in some sense, that plan, that entire history. The open view would say, no, that's not how God's running the show.
It was when I first heard of the open position, it was from its detractors, which do less than a fair representation of it, and in many ways, it's almost unrecognizable, depending on who's providing the critique. But in this paper, it's specifically exploring four different models of divine providence in light of their handling of the problem of evil. And when people are tuning in, they're coming from various backgrounds and levels of study. Could you tell us just briefly what the problem of evil essentially is?
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, when we talk about an evil in the sense of the problem of evil, we're basically talking about anything that, when considered on its own, seems to be bad. It could range from the horrors of the Holocaust, like the really big and grandiose and complex, bad things, or it could be just getting stung by a mosquito. There, a little bit of pain, having a headache, um, the whole range of things that seem like the minuses in the of life. Um,
So
and
it's
so,
not just the extreme examples that we're talking about here, but it's anything less than what we would idealize as perfection.
yeah, the whole range from the small to the big, everything that at least at first glance might seem to be out of place. If we are supposing that the universe is uh, uh, governed by a God who is all powerful and all good and all knowing, right? You might think, uh, again, uh, if God is all powerful, then He can create a world that is absolutely perfect. It's perfect bliss from beginning to end. You know, and He's got the power to do that because He's all powerful. And you might say, well, if He's all good, well then He would surely want to do that. So, uh, why do we have these bad things in life, ranging from minor annoyances to, these horrible atrocities? Um, and and it includes a lot of facets. From like not just like human sin, but pain and suffering, not just human pain and suffering, but animal pain, um, uh, and even things like the issues of heaven, hell, and the afterlife can be rolled into the problem of evil. Like if if you know is it consistent with an all-powerful and all just and all good God to send people to hell for all eternity? Yeah, it's a fair question. Um, um, uh, you know, so it's a problem which has lots of different facets because there's lots of different kinds of evil, and Christians and the theists of all sorts down through the centuries have kind of grappled with that, trying to, well, yeah, initially it seems like there's a difficulty here. Why would an all good, all powerful God allow these kinds of things to happen? And so there's been lots of thought that's gone into, well, how do you respond to that? How might we reconcile our conception of God and the way He manages the universe with all of the evils that seem to be around us?
Mm. And you outlined was it five? I believe five responses in your paper that one could provide to this
Yeah,
issue. Would you
yeah,
mind touching on those just briefly?
sure, I can do that. I don't know that we'll have time to talk much about them all because I want to focus on.
Oh, yeah, you can just give us the 1,000-foot view. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the second one. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways you might respond to problem of evil. So you have some evil you've identified. Here's this bad thing out there, and you're wondering, how do I, as a theist, how do I, as a Christian, how do I reconcile that with my understanding of God? One thing you might do, and this is a common response, is to propose what's called a theodicy. A theodicy is just, it's just a proposed, um, well, it's a proposal for, like how we might think about God's reasons for permitting or bringing about certain kinds of evils. And it's supposed to be a theory that says, well, God had these sorts of reasons for permitting these kinds of evils, and these reasons seem like good reasons to us for God to do that. So, for example, the probably most well-known theodicy is called the Free Will Theodicy, and it has to do specifically with moral evils, evils that have to do with people behaving badly. Okay, and the Free Will Theodicy says, well, for a variety of reasons, God wanted there to be creatures who had significant moral freedom, who were able to choose between good and evil. And because of this, he creates us with the real possibility of choosing evil. And because he values having free creatures, he can't interfere without, and just prevent us misusing our free choice without defeating his ultimate goals and having free creatures in the first place. So he has this kind of forced choice. Are you going to have free creatures who have moral freedom to choose good and evil? If so, then you've got to allow for the possibility that some of them are actually going to do moral evil. And that's the cost of having morally free creatures. Mm-hmm. The alternative would be for God to step in and micromanage and prevent any of his creatures from ever misusing their freedom. But then he would effectively be denying them their freedom. So, God's got this good that he wants to have. He wants to have a universe with free creatures, but the cost of that is you have to allow space for moral evil. That's
it makes sense. To have a truly free creature, then they need to have the freedom and opportunity to rebel, as it were. Mm-hmm. But then you also offered a couple other responses. I know you wanted to highlight these quickly, but you offered an axiological adjustment. And what do you see as a good summary of that?
All right. Yes. So, all right. So another type of response, distinct from offering a theodicy, is what I call an axiological adjustment. Axiology just means the study of value. What is good? And there's lots of theories about how to think about that. But one way we might deal with how to make sense out of some evil that we witness is to recontextualize that evil in relation to the big picture, right? We might say, well, considered just on its own, this thing looks really bad, but when you look at it in a larger context, it actually fits. It makes sense. Hello, okay, I've got a little visitor here.
That's fine. I've got 5 as well.
Okay.
They can walk in at any
All right,
moment. That's precious. That's precious.
Anyway, that's my 7-year-old. Let me see. So, I don't want to say anything about it. Yeah. So some things that might seem like really bad, just think about it on itself. Like, say, for example, having a toothache, right? You have pain in your tooth. Well, it might seem really bad in itself, but if you think about in the larger context, well, what that pain is alerting you to is that there's something going on in your tooth that needs to be fixed. And if you didn't feel that pain, you wouldn't think to go to the dentist and get that fixed. And if you didn't get it fixed, it might cause you a whole lot more suffering down the road. Like you might, lose your teeth altogether, right? So small pains can sometimes be worth it in order to prevent us from having, larger pains down the road, for example.
And so when you were preparing this article, you took all of these different responses into account in light of the problem of evil, and then you tried to provide an overview of really the different views on divine providence and how they would respond. But you did something very fascinating in this, and I was telling you before the program started, I hadn't seen a lot of addressing this, but you pointed out retrospective and prospective problems of evil, and I wanted to give you just a minute, if you would, to kind of lay out what is meant by retrospective and prospective with regard to the
Yeah.
problem.
Okay. Yeah. Let me just step back for one brief minute. So,
Yes,
one of the other types of responses that I'm going to that I look at to the problem of evil is called a theoretical adjustment, and this is how should we think about? Well, one way to address the problem of evil is to adjust how you think about God and God's relation to the world, and that brings up questions. Well, how does God manage the world, and what is God like? And you get, and so most of my paper is going to focus on that, looking at different models of God and models of divine providence. But I'm trying to sort of compare and contrast these models. And as I was thinking about the different models in relation to the problem of evil, it seemed to me that there was a distinction that really hasn't been brought out much in the literature between what I decided to call the retrospective and the prospective problems of evil. The retrospective problem is the more familiar, the kind of standard thing where you see some evil and you're wondering about God's role in the coming to be of that evil. Like, why did God permit that? When presumably, as all-powerful God, could have prevented it. Or on some views of providence, well, actually ask a stronger question: why did God specifically ordain that? And so forth. So that's where you have an evil before you, and you're kind of looking at sort of the God in relation to the whole causal history that led up to that evil. God presumably could have intervened any point along the line and charted a different course for history and stopped that evil, but he didn't. So why? The other type of question you can ask, and this is what I call the prospective or the forward-looking problem, is okay. Maybe we've got like we think we have a satisfactory answer to why God allows some evil to come about in the first place. But once the evil's there, what, if anything, can God do about it? Like another name for this might be the eschatological problem, if you will. Can God in some way redeem these evils? Can God bring enough good out of them to justify or to compensate for the existence of the evils in the first place? To take an example of just the salvation of humanity. If God gives us free will to go our own way and to rebel against God, God's presumably got reasons for doing that, and those are good reasons. That would be kind of the retrospective problem. Why did God allow this situation to come about? But then we can think about the different strategies or things God might have for what to do about it going forward. Some people propose like a view of, like universalism, or annihilationism. God at some point in the future is going to literally wipe out all evil, either by annihilating it or ensuring that everybody winds up on his team in the end, right? And this would be, one way in which, to try to address sort of the prospective problem of evil, that in the final analysis, every tier will be will be wiped away. Every pain will be soothed. All the emotional hurt and everything um, um, will be healed. Um, but not every model of God kind of allows equal prospects for that sort of ultimate healing. And so I wanted to kind of have a way of contrasting different models by sort of what they could offer us looking forward, and also what they have to explain looking backward. Does that make sense?
It does, and there's a cost depending on which way you go. And I think you did a great job of drawing out all of the nuances on the topic. And I think you did a fair representation of the different views, and it was a fascinating read, and one that I recommend if you're going to pull up the paper and read it, that you do it a couple times. There's a lot of content here. It's fascinating, and it really gives you a lot to chew on too. But where would you like to go next? We've talked about the overarching issues. We talked about a couple of responses. Do you want to dig into the meat and potatoes, as it were, or was there a few more points that you wanted to hash out before we get into that?
Let me think. I don't want to get too much in the weeds, because then we'll run out of time.
Yeah, and I don't want to have to diagram and chart and pull that up so we can do that. But I want to be fair to the paper and make sure that we're getting those points across that you really want to hit on.
I'd recommend that we probably move on to discussing the four models of providence.
Excellent.
And then just head straight into the different issues that come up for each of them with respect to the problem of evil, both retrospectively and prospectively.
Okay.
So that sounds good to you. Let me start in cashing out these different models. First, let me just say a general point. It makes a lot of sense when talking about the problem of evil to look at models of providence. And a lot of discussions of the problem of evil in the literature kind of just sort of take on, consider like a generic form of theism or a generic form of Christian theism without really specifying what sort of model of providence we have in view. And I think that's a significant omission that's there in much of the literature, because it really does matter what model you have. So, for example, when we talk about providence, what we're talking about is all of the different ways in which God relates to creation, right? All of the different ways in which God, as it were, provides for creation. Okay, we can say God, in some sense, causes it to be. He brings creation about in the first place. We can say that he sustains it in some sense. He keeps it going. We could say that maybe on occasion God sort of intervenes in it, through a miraculous event or an incarnation. We can say God is maybe guiding creation or helping steer it in some direction, nudging it this way or that. There's lots of facets to divine providence, right? And so a model of providence is going to try to flesh out a lot of this and say, well, here's the basic picture. Here's how God interacts with the world, right? So that said, a couple more general type of comments. I want to distinguish some terms. Um, First, I want to say that one way to distinguish models of providence is in terms of the specificity of uh, sort of God's ordering of creation. All right, and the easiest way to make this clear is you can think of God either as a sort of a micromanager, right, or as a delegator.
Right. You've got the R.C. Sproul school that says there's not one rogue molecule, that he's the ultimate micromanager.
Yeah.
And then you have more of like an orthodox folks that are familiar with maybe like the Bible Project. They would see that they really try to show God as more of a delegator who's bestowed upon man some degree of autonomy and self-determinative.
Yeah. That's excellent. Yeah. So a couple of the models take the micromanaging approach, and the other two that I'm going to discuss take the delegator approach. I'm going to call the first class, I'll say they have a meticulous view of divine providence. Okay, every detail is specified in God's plan for creation. On the delegator side, I'm going to say they have a general view of divine providence, that it's not the case that every detail of history is sort of pre-specified by God. All right. So that's one distinction. Let me see. In my chart here. So let me see if I have to say anything else. Yeah. Why don't I dive into these models? I think I can make the other distinctions along the way.
Okay.
So the first model, and I want to discuss, I call it theistic determinism. Some people call it divine determinism or theological determinism. It's typical of people who hold to, say, a Calvinist system of theology, are typically theistic determinists. So they don't strictly have to be, but it's the most common combination there. People who are Thomists, the kind of views of Thomas Aquinas, I think if they're consistent, they're going to wind up being theistic determinists. But again, not all self-professed followers of Aquinas would embrace it. So, but regardless, the theistic determinist takes a very meticulous view. God, from the beginning, from creation, from before creation, God ordains, in the words of the Westminster Confession, whatsoever comes to pass. Every specific event that ever happens throughout history, past, present, and future, is part of God's creative decree. Right? Moreover, the theistic determinist is going to say that the kind of world God has created is, well, God is the ultimate sufficient cause of everything that happens. So either directly, like if God brings about a miracle, God's doing something directly in creation, or, when God creates in the first place, it's God's direct action that brings things about. Or indirectly through what are referred to as secondary causes, like
So
God
kind of
knocks
like,
over.
is he flipping over a domino and watching the rest fall, knowing the way they'll fall, or is he individually knocking?
Yeah. So we could imagine, and the one thing, if you could say, God, he directly kicks over a specific domino, that, or he knocks over the first one in a chain, and he's arranged the universe such that this is a deterministic chain, so that there's only one causally possible way that events can unfold once that first once the first of the domino has fallen. And so God basically has set up the whole universe to play out exactly as he has ordained it to, and is ordaining whatsoever comes to pass. And there's no possibility, there's no causal freedom or indeterminism for creation to deviate at all from that path. Um, um, so, so on this model, we would say God's activity toward creation is always determinative. We also say that we'll also say God is not receptive to creaturely influence. Why not? Well, because the arrow of causation is always going from God to creation. It never goes the other way. Right?
That's a great
God
point.
is right. God is ordaining everything. He's making it all happen ultimately, and things are going to play out exactly as He wants. So God's not receptive to creaturely input. He doesn't need to be. He's making it all happen. The Theistic Determinists would also say that there were no contingent constraints on what God could do with creation. If there were any limits on what God could do, they were limits that were built into God's own nature, and hence are necessary constraints. Like, God presumably, because God is all good, couldn't make a universe that was objectively just, a horrible thing. He would have to do a universe that was, at least from his perspective, overall good.
And you'll hear theistic determinists often go that line of thought when they say that God causes or decrees or ordains, whatever the particular nuance of their terminology, a particular evil, but it's for His ultimate glory. So they try to say that from this perspective of eternity, we're seeing an evil, but ultimately it's going to bring glory to God. And so you'll see that kind of hashed out as they're trying to explain why He caused this, but they're ultimately saying, well, it was for God's good to some extent.
Yeah.
Some grand purpose that perhaps we're not aware of.
Yeah. So does that make sense? If that does, I can move on to the second model.
So that's theistic determinism in a nutshell, is that in the causal chain, everything is flowing from God, either through a series that He's set in motion or direct acts upon the agent or the event.
Yeah. Or just the coming to be of creation in the first place, which isn't acting upon anything, but it's causing it to be. But God's activity with respect to creation is always determinative, and hence, insofar as we are free on that model, we are free in a compatibilistic sense. Right? Mm-hmm. So we don't have freedom in in an indeterministic or libertarian way, if that model is correct. All right, next model, the Molinist, named after a Jesuit scholar, I think 15th, 16th century, Luis de Molina. He developed this model because he was trying to reconcile creaturely freedom with a very meticulous view of divine providence. So he liked this meticulous idea. God, from the beginning, has sort of mapped out exactly how creation's going to go, right? But he wanted to try to find a way to have a robust kind of creaturely freedom and fit that into the picture. And after thinking about it for a while, he came up with this idea that came to be known as middle knowledge, or Molinism, named after Molina. The distinct feature of Molinism is it says that prior to deciding what world to create, God had a very special kind of information available to Him. He had this middle knowledge. And what makes it middle is that it's in between His natural knowledge and His free knowledge. By that I mean it's information that doesn't come from God's nature, so it's not part of His natural knowledge. And it's also information that doesn't come from God's free choice to create. So it's pre-volitional. So it's information that God has on the basis of which he chooses what world to create, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what kind of information this? According to Molina, this information consists of all of these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, all these wood counterfactuals. So, if I were to create creature X and place creature X in circumstance C, then creature X would freely do, A, whatever, or would freely not do that. And so with God having in mind a kind of this information about what every possible free creature that he could have created would have freely done in any circumstance in which it could have acted freely. That's supposed to be God's middle knowledge, and it's extremely contentious as to whether God could even have that information. But I'm going to set aside that for purposes of this paper, so I'm not going to press the grounding objection or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Because you really just focus mainly on how each of these views responds to the problem of evil, retro, and then prospectively, not necessarily presenting an individual critique on the larger merits of each view.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So the Molinist is going to agree with the Theistic Determinist that God's providence is meticulous, that is, at every detail, right, whatsoever comes to pass is ordained by God. But they are going to say it's not the case that God's activity toward creation is always determining. So they'll say, no, God created free creatures. They will also, but they will agree also with the Theistic Determinists in saying that there isn't any real receptivity from God on the in God on the part of creation. So you really don't need a causal arrow going from creation to God on Molinism, because with his middle knowledge, God can plan out exactly how things are going to fall out, even if creatures have freedom to go their own way. So he'll say, okay, if I create this circumstance, then these creatures will freely do this, and then in the resulting circumstance that comes from that, I know that they will freely behave this way and will freely behave this way. And God had all of that information from before even deciding what to do. And so there's no further information that creation is going to supply to God at that point, right? God's got it all mapped out. No, there aren't any sort of details to be filled in by creaturely choices. That's all stuff God knew beforehand. So he had the information from the get-go. So
and
there's no
wonder,
real...
You see a potential issue there, because you wonder about a collapse into everything being necessary there, depending on how that's hashed out. So there are some different areas that could go as far as objections. But again, I'm going to try and stay on topic tonight.
Yeah, I agree. We could do another episode just on Molinism.
Yeah.
And I could tell you all the different reasons I don't think it works.
I love my Molinist brothers, and as I was studying the main different views, initially I found Molinism very appealing because of its strong commitment to libertarian free will. Ultimately, as I continued my studies, I drifted further and further away from that. But I do really value and appreciate that commitment to that libertarian freedom.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was a Molinist for about 4 or 5 years, but gradually became dissatisfied with it and finally decided I had to give it up because I don't think it works at the end of the day. But we'll leave that as
we'll table that. So then
discussion for another day.
We've covered theistic determinism. We've covered middle knowledge, or the view from Molina. And
I want to say
go ahead.
I'm going to say just one more thing about Molinism that distinguishes it from theistic determinism is, I said, the theistic determinist says that there were no contingent constraints on what God could do. Right? The only constraints on what God could do with creation were ones stemming from God's own nature. The Molinist can't say that, because the Molinist wants to say what God can do with creation is limited by his middle knowledge. This information about what creatures would freely do in all of these hypothetical circumstances, this information that does not come from God's nature. It does not come from creation, because it is free volitional, independently of whether there is any creation at all. Mm-hmm. And so you get this information that kind of comes from nowhere, and yet somehow constrains what God can do. And so Molinists will say, there are all these possible worlds that, like coherent possible worlds, but God couldn't create a whole bunch of those because they don't, because they conflict with his middle knowledge, right? So the range of, God's range of creative possibilities is limited from the possible worlds, all of these, down to a smaller group they call the feasible worlds. Mm-hmm. That's all the possible worlds that line up with his middle knowledge. Right?
And then from there, it seems that you see it a further narrowing into a perfect world, given all of the viable options, that this was the best one that he chose. And so I've heard Molinists define this as a perfect world, potentially, given the options among those feasible worlds.
Maybe, though. I mean, it can certainly be argued that God would have to create the best possible world, but it's also, I think, been argued by a lot of different people that there just is no such thing as a best possible world. There is no unique best, or perhaps even that the concept of a best world just isn't well defined. So I wouldn't want to press that objection. Maybe at the end of the day, we should agree with Leibniz that God must create the best of all possible worlds, but I'm not going to say that we have to go down that route. Okay, next, open theism. So
now open theism, the second word in that theological system is really important. I mean, it is a form of theism. I've heard some recent criticism of it, but it is a theistic viewpoint, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and as you lift your happy atheist cup, right?
Yeah. Shout out to one of my good friends, Jonathan Cook. He is a evangelical atheist, and he heard that I had somehow joined his group as a fellow atheist because I hold an open view, and so he let me borrow his cup for this broadcast.
Yeah. So open theism is a form of theism. We do not, we believe there is one God who would necessarily exist, who created the world ex nihilo, and who is essentially maximally good, knowing, powerful, and so forth. Kind of the standard litany of, how, at least how philosophers typically describe God. Nearly all of that can apply to theism as open theists conceive it. So there is a group of theists who call themselves classical theists, and they have a much stronger and more rigid view of God. And some of those people will say, if you don't have our very, very strong model, then you just ain't a theist at all. And if those people are right, then Molinists are not theists, and open theists aren't theists, and most theistic determinists aren't theists, and pretty much nobody that I'm talking about in this paper qualifies as a theist. And I think that's just crazy.
It's really funny. Yeah. I had Ryan Mullins on the program, and he had noted how most of the classical positions, Calvinism, Molinism, classical theism, all begin with an open premise that, at least in a logical moment, that there was a time in the life of God where the future was alethically open. So technically, it seems like the vast majority of Christian positions begin with an open premise. So if they cast that out of the kingdom, so to speak, they're kind of pulling the rug out from underneath themselves, I would see. But
Yeah, if you think God was free to create or not to create, or free to create one sort of world as opposed to another, then there's got to be some sort of a moment in the creation process, right? Like the not having yet decided moment, where God's got these options, create or not create, where it's still an open question, whether God's going to create or what sort of world God's going to create, and so forth. So you do have this kind of at least an open moment for any view that says God is genuinely free. But anyway, moving on. Open theism, unlike Molinism and Theistic Determinism, has a non-meticulous view of divine providence. So God has not ordained whatsoever comes to pass. Rather, God has deliberately decided not to ordain everything that comes to pass. God has this, God on this model is a delegator, not a micromanager, right? So God has chosen to leave some aspects of history up to his creatures to decide. He's given us kind of our own little domain of freedom and said, okay, you make the best of this that you can, and of course he's there to help us along the way, but
and the scripture equivalent would be something like referencing to God as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that he has delegated to us a degree of authority and autonomy. So it's not just purely in the realm of the philosophical. This is deeply scriptural justification for the open view as well. I just wanted to point that out so that no one out there goes, well, where's the Bible in all of this, Alan? Because that's really what we're applying critical thinking to the text of Scripture and trying to arrive at a understanding of God from that. Yeah,
I agree with that. I agree with that. I'm not bringing up much Scripture in this, but that's in part because I'm a philosopher. I'm not a biblical scholar, and in part because it would take us way too far afield.
It's a different area of expertise and different area of focus. It doesn't mean that they're not compatible or that they're at odds. It's just it's a different way of arriving there.
Yeah. All of the positions I'm going to be discussing can be at least argued for from Scripture. You've talked to Calvinists. They've got their proof text. You can talk to a Molinist, they'll have their proof text they'll whip out. You talk to, an open theist, they'll have passages that they point to that they think, this supports my view, and so forth. That's another whole debate. And if we were to dive into the Bible, we'd be opening up that can of worms and not being able to make any real progress in thinking about the problem of evil.
Yes, sir.
So point
taken. Let's stay on task.
Yeah. So the first important point about open theism has a general model of providence, not a meticulous model. It does affirm a kind of creaturely, libertarian freedom that creatures have this indeterministic, choices to make. It's not pre-programmed in the history of the cosmos or in God's decree. Because of that, because of this openness that God has put into creation, there does need to be some kind of divine receptivity to creation. So this is the first of the models that requires at least some kind of divine passibility, a receptivity of God to creation, in the sense that insofar as the future is open, say I've got a choice to make, I can go this way or that way. It up to the point of my choice, it is really an open question how I shall go. And I am the one who makes that choice, right? I choose the path. And so by doing so, I am turning an open question into a settled matter. And that means I am adding new information. You know, I'm turning an either or into, like either A or B into, say, A. You can't derive A just from either A or B, right? So there's new information that's added there, and that means God, as if he creates an open universe, God is going to be receptive to new information as we make our choices. God, of course, is going to be aware of that, and he's going to know how we, what we're doing with the freedom he's given us. So there's got to be an arrow, at least, that points back from that points from creation toward God.
And I know we're not supposed to go too far off task, but you'll see evidence of this where he just simply says, "Because you did this, this is what I'm doing." So, we do see receptivity in the text. So, don't want to linger there too much, but yeah.
Yeah. Next point. Again, we talked about whether there were contingent constraints on God's options. The theistic determinist says no, right? The only constraints on God's options for creation come from God himself. The Molinist says, yes, there are these contingent constraints. God's middle knowledge limits what God can do. The open theist on this point is like the theistic determinist. The open theist says, no, the only constraints that God has and what he could create come from God's own nature. So the open theist will say, had he wanted to, God could have done exactly what the theistic determinist says God has done. God could have created a closed future, right? One that God determines all, the entire course of history. But God decided not to do that. God didn't want that kind of world. Maybe, on certain views of what it means for God to be loving, it might follow that God couldn't have done that. But with respect to God's power and God's nature, there's no contingent constraints on God. Okay. All right. Last view, process theism. This is a view that many, myself included, would regard as kind of outside of Christian orthodoxy. But it is a view that is popular, at least, especially in discussions of the problem of evil. And so I wanted to include it because it provides a very helpful contrast, especially to theistic determinism, which is kind of like the flip side of process theism. So the process theist, like the open theist, has a general model of providence. God does not ordain whatsoever comes to pass. But the process theist goes much further. Whereas the open theist will say that God probably and can and does ordain some of what comes to pass, the process theist will say no. God doesn't ordain anything that comes to pass. Right? From as far as God is concerned, the future is not just open; it's wide open. Okay, pretty much anything is, at least at some level, possible. God's activity toward creation on this model is never determining. Right? It's contrasts with the theist determinist that it's always determining. Right? The process view says God's activity toward creation is always persuasive. That's the word a lot of them like to use. God, in some sense, kind of nudge or help steer or kind of, pull creation this way or that way, but never in such a way as to ensure a particular result. So there's the guy who is probably more than anyone responsible for the development of process theism was a philosopher by the name of Alfred Whitehead. And in his metaphysics, he proposes that there is this principle of creativity that is absolutely fundamental. It's part of the bedrock of his ontology. Everything that exists is necessarily creative to some degree. And so he has this view that even like subatomic particles, which he doesn't think of as like substances or things, he thinks that as the building blocks of creation are these sort of fleeting microscopic events they called actual entities or actual occasions. And each of these occasions, it has a kind of intrinsic degree of freedom with how it's going to roll into the next event. And God is providing these lures, these ideas, or kind of, like possibilities that he's holding out to how the kind of next step in the evolution of this world process might go. But the actual entities, there's always this creative freedom there in whether they're going to, accept God's lure that he's holding out or go a different way. So God, on this view, yes, is necessarily receptive to creaturely input because God's always responding and reacting to, things went this way, now I'm going to lure it this way, and now I'm going to lure it this way. And God's trying to sort of keep things on track and wherever God wants things to go. But creation necessarily has this kind of ineliminable degree of freedom to do otherwise than what God wants. And God can't get rid of that. On this view, there are always contingent constraints on God's options. Because process theists reject the idea of creation ex nihilo. God did not just, bring creation into being by fiat, let there be. On the process view, there is always a prior state of creation. Because they think of sort of God in the world as kind of like in this relation of symbiosis. God needs the world and the world needs God. The world needs God to provide sort of the direction, the lures to help guide the world in one sense, in one way or another. Whereas God needs the world to get anything done. And so a lot of process theists will use this metaphor. The world is God's body. God's the mind. A creation is his body, and so without a body to move, God wouldn't be able to do anything. But without a mind to guide it, the body wouldn't be able to do anything. And so the combination of God plus the world is this sort of world process.
And the Christology within process theism is another area that I think it tends to deviate from Christian orthodoxy.
It's very hard to see how you could have an orthodox Christology or anything in a process model. There are people who do a lot of work trying to marry Christianity and process theism. And maybe if you tweak the process model in certain ways, you can get somewhat of a mesh, but you're going to have problems. Anything involving miraculous intervention, that's going to be, no, God can't do that. God can, well, he can try, but, he can't make anything happen unilaterally. So, those are the four models in a nutshell. I'm ready to go on to talking about how they face against the problem of evil.
Yes, here's where the rubber meets the road. So we've got these. We've outlined what the problem of evil is. We've covered a few different possible responses, and we've looked at these different models of divine providence. So now, Alan, please tell us how each of these fare and the way that they go about that.
Okay, I'm going to do it in a different order than I just discussed. I'm going to talk about theistic determinism first. Then I'm going to jump over to process theism because that's kind of the polar opposite. And I think it's helpful to see the contrast.
Makes sense.
Then I'll move to Molinism and finally to open theism. Okay, theistic determinism. I think, in my judgment, the big challenge for it, because it says that everything that ever comes to pass is not only ordained by God, but ultimately caused by God. Mm-hmm. I think the theistic determinist is going to have a very hard time with what I've called the retrospective problem of evil. Here's all this bad stuff. why did God permit this? Well, on the theistic determinist view, God never merely permits anything, right? He ordains it and ultimately causes it. So for a theistic determinist to talk in terms of divine permission is kind of disingenuous, right? They're underselling their own view there. Um, uh, uh, so why would God? Okay, if God, again, has no initial contingent constraints, God can get any sort of world He wants, consistent with His own nature. So why does He create a world with all of the evils that we see around us, when God could have, at least as far as His power goes, easily have gotten something different? That's a tough question, I think, for the theist determinists to answer. I think what they normally do is they'll invoke a response called um, I'm thinking of the name, I'm blanking on it right now. Skeptical theism, which is to say, well, God is so far above us, we are finite creatures, so we really shouldn't expect at all to understand God's ways and the mysteries of the divine will, and so yeah, even though we're kind of bothered by all this bad stuff and why God might have ordained it and everything, we're in no position to gainsay God on this.
It's kind of you'll hear a common response. They'll say, "Who are you, oh man?" It's in that same sort of like, who
Romans
are you
chapter
to
9.
talk back to God? And they just assume that view is the correct one. And if you question it, you're questioning God, not necessarily the view. But
so I think there are two ways one can kind of appeal to sort of skeptical theism, or as I call it earlier in the paper, the appeal to mystery, or playing the mystery card. One is in the context where it's simply I'm trying to remember how I put it, where where we simply lack information, right? Uh, uh, here's some evil, E, we'll call it, and it simply does not seem to us that God has a good reason for bringing about E. Okay, why to say it does not seem to us, this means we lack a certain understanding. Okay, we don't understand God's rationale, God's ways here. That is the context in which I think one can plausibly play the skeptic card here. You can say, well, yeah, but yeah, it doesn't seem to us, or it's not clear to us why God allowed these things, but we shouldn't expect to understand why God would allow these things. God's ways are higher than our ways. All right, I think that's a defensible move there, but I don't think the theistic determinist can. Well, I think the theistic determinist has to use skeptical theism in a stronger way, at least when it comes to moral evil. And this is kind of human sin, right? When people behave badly and do things God doesn't want them to do. And so with respect to moral evil, let me put it this way. If God ordains and ultimately causes whatsoever comes to pass, including every moral evil that ever occurs throughout all of history, presumably God's got a reason for doing this, a reason that to God seems to be good, right? So in God's mind, right, the good, whatever that is exactly, is compatible with every instance of moral evil throughout history, right? So moral evil is compatible with the good. But it seems to me that that there's a widespread and I think very strong moral intuition that many, if not all of us, have at some level, that moral evil, if anything, is incompatible with the good. That whenever a sin happens, that there's something that ought not to have been, and then that's a sort of a categorical ought there. That the world is overall worse off for having moral evil in it than it would be if it didn't have it. And so if that, just to make a couple references here, in Romans, there's a verse where the Apostle Paul considers this idea: shall we do evil that good may result? And he says, no way, man.
That's right. That's the modern translation. No way, dude. Like, come
on. But it seems like if God has ordained all this moral evil for some great good that God has in mind that we don't really understand, then God is doing the exact sort of thing that Paul is saying no way to. Is saying God is doing evil, or if not like doing the evil, he's causing the doing of moral evil that good may result.
It's kind of like, who are you, oh Paul?
Yeah. And so if this way of thinking is right, that moral evil is incompatible with good, or at least a lot of us are inclined to think so, then you have this tension here, right? On the one hand, theistic determinism implies that the good, whatever ultimate objectives God is aiming at, and God is by definition good, so these goals of God's must be good, and is compatible with a whole lot of moral evil, on the one hand. On the other hand, we have this real strong moral intuition that the good is incompatible with moral evil. So it seems to me that theistic determinism is going to push toward moral skepticism, because it's telling us at a deep level that something we think to be true, namely that moral evil is incompatible with goodness, is not true. Because God believes otherwise, and God says, no, it actually is compatible with lots and lots of moral evil. The good can't both be compatible and incompatible with a whole lot of moral evil, right? Certainly not all the moral evil that we witness around us, and so something's got to give here. And if we assume, as seems plausible, that God is by definition right, then it would seem that we must consider ourselves wrong in thinking in our thinking about what would seem, at least to me, to be a very fundamental moral intuition. And if we can be wrong about that, then I don't think I understand morality at that point. I don't really know how to tell up from down, left from right, when it comes to goodness, or how to even think of God as good. If God is, specifically ordaining every moral evil for some good that I cannot fathom. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge for theistic determinism, to make moral sense of how God can ordain and ultimately cause all this moral evil without leading straight into a very strong form of moral skepticism. On the flip side, though, here's a big plus for theistic determinism. If you turn around to think about the prospective aspect of the problem of evil, what can God do moving forward about it? Well, here the theistic determinist is in great shape, because there's no constraints on what God can do, right, other than God's own nature. So moving forward, hey, if God wants to completely eliminate all evil, or to save everyone, right, like the universal salvation, God can do it. Now, of course, there's a lot of theologies, like limited atonement views, that say God deliberately doesn't do that, and then you got another problem for theistic determinism, right? If God doesn't save everyone, but easily could have, why didn't he? and
Well,
that's somewhat puzzling. But
it's a
well,
further
let's set
blur the
that.
line between good and evil there, doesn't it?
Yeah, but suppose we set that aside and we just think, what could God do moving forward? And yeah, he could easily wipe away every tear. He could redeem every evil that's ever happened uh, by providing more than adequate like compensation to anyone who's ever suffered. You know, by some kind of perfect afterlife or something, right? God can turn everything around. Again, not everyone who's a theistic determinist thinks God is going to turn everything around. At least not for the those not destined for heaven. Um, but in theory, God could just do that. So in this respect, with respect to the retrospective problem of evil, why did God bring all this bad stuff to happen? I don't think theistic determinism comes off looking very good. I want to give it kind of a bad grade when it comes to the problem of evil. But looking forward, I think it gets a pretty good grade. You know, there's no sort of in principle reason. Again, we're abstracting from Scripture, we're abstracting from the theological debates over limited atonement and whatnot. There's no in principle reason why God couldn't just save everyone in the end and make everyone perfectly happy. Okay. So in one respect, theistic determinism does very poorly. In the other respect, it does very well. Moving on, process theism, it flips around. Okay. Process theist, when we're looking at retrospectively, right, God's involvement in the coming to be of all these bad things. The process theist has the perfect excuse for God. God was always doing everything he could, but the actual occasions, the world process just didn't cooperate, and God couldn't have done any more than he did. You know, uh, so like Tom Ward, a friend of ours, wrote this book called God Can't, and his solution to the problem of evil is ultimately, God's always doing everything he can to bring about the most good in any situation, but God simply cannot prevent evils from happening. And in a way, yeah, if that's right, that gets God off the hook. You can't blame God for anything. Um, uh, uh, you know, um,
Yeah, I mean, essentially, God's saying, "Don't blame me. I did my best. I tried,
yeah.
and you guys just weren't cooperating."
Now here's one hitch though that could come up for the process theist here. So they perhaps don't get off quite scot-free here, uh, because we start thinking about how much influence God has. Uh, like degrees of influence can range anywhere from none at all to completely determining. You know, suppose God's influence is, like, I don't know, like 50% or whatever. Well, then we might think that more often, or well, say like 60% strong. Then we might think, well, more often than not, God's going to get his way,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then we might think that there's a whole lot more moral evil or evil in general than we might expect if God normally gets his way and is always guiding the universe in the perfect direction. So here's the dilemma for the process theist, right? If God's degree of influence over the world process is very high, close to but not quite determinative, then it seems very plausible that God should have been able to avoid the vast majority of the evils that we see around us. On the other hand, if his influence is very, very weak, okay, well then there's no particular expectation that God should have been able to avoid the evils and stuff. but then it becomes a lot harder to justify the idea that God is in any sense all powerful or even deserving of the title God. If God has so little influence on the course of things, then why should anyone trust in God, right? So it's kind of a dilemma there. Of course, they might split the difference and say, well, somewhere in the middle, and God's got just enough influence, but not too much, and so that the kind of world we see around us, where there's some mix of good and evil, is about exactly what we would expect. All right, perhaps that's right. All right, flip it around now. Okay, moving forward, prospectively, what can the process God do about evils moving forward? Can God guarantee salvation? Can God perfectly redeem any evil? Can God achieve an eschaton where the kingdom of heaven will come about and that will last forever and ever? And I think the answer has got to be no. The reason for this is because on process grounds, there is this ineliminable component of creativity that is always there in any world, in any part of the world process. Every actual entity, every minute event has this degree of freedom that God cannot eliminate.
Creativity is a kind way of saying mischief,
Yeah, it's like the Epicurean swerve, like the atoms just kind of randomly go off in a direction. So if this is right, then suppose God's been luring the world, has been guiding the world process as best he can toward this utopia, this heavenly state. And suppose by some miraculous convergence of creaturely cooperation, it's achieved. There's no guarantee that state is at all stable. In fact, you would expect that eventually, if not, like sooner rather than later, all hell is going to break loose again, and we're going to be exactly right back where we started. So there's really no way to have a final answer to evil in the process of worldview. It's always going to be a thing.
And that seems to loop back into their starting premise of God and creation being co-eternal, and then this consistent. It seems to be almost cyclical to that regard. That even if you were to achieve that state, that it would fall apart and you would be right back to where we started. Yeah.
So with respect to the kind of the retrospective side of the problem of evil, I give process theism a good grade. I think it gets God sort of off the hook as far as any view could, essentially. That doesn't just like eliminate God altogether. Right? If there is no God, then God's certainly not on the hook for anything. But on the prospectively, it seems to me to be very weak. It doesn't offer any real stable hope for the future. Again, this is just the flip side of theistic determinism. The one has, God is omni-controlling, and as a result, retrospectively looking, why did all this bad stuff happen? It's kind of impossible to get God fully off the hook for anything, right? God is sort of fully on the hook because he ultimately caused everything to happen just the way it did.
And a good theistic determinist like John MacArthur has actually come in and said, you can't get God off the hook for evil. I mean, some in that camp will just flat out own it and go, no, absolutely, God is responsible and he did it, and who are you? You're just going to have to suck it up and deal with it.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at some of the rhetoric that like Calvinists and others will use, like a lot of them, as you said, will concede that, but they'll refocus toward the other kind of side of the problem and say, well, looking forward, God is working all things for the good of those who love him, right? Mm-hmm. And so as the part of their selling point for this model of providence is, hey, we can look forward to the future with absolute confidence that God is going to, going to sort it all out and do right, right? So they're playing to their strength when they do that, and it
It's
kind of
understandable, but it's still
ignoring,
kind of ignoring the weakness. Yeah.
yeah, and the process folks do exactly the same thing in the other direction. They love to, point out how every other view has, you know, can't really fully get God off the hook for the bad things that happen. Uh, you know, uh, at the very least, God could have prevented that. Why didn't He? You can't answer that. Therefore, we win on the problem of evil in that respect. On the other hand, looking forward, they've got by far the weakest position to offer. So it's natural that in their polemics, they're going to focus where their view is kind of comparatively stronger and tend to, kind of push to the side or, not call attention to the respects in which their view is comparatively weaker. Right.
And you did note, I mean, these are pretty much polar opposites or mirrors of one another as far as their handling of the problem of evil, and you see that interplay at work there.
Yeah. All right. Molinism and open theism are both, in some respects, middle of the road positions. They both lie somewhere between theistic determinism and open theism. And as you might expect, as a result, they're going to have a somewhat easier time than theistic determinism does with the retrospective questions about evil, and a somewhat easier time than process theism does with respect to the prospective questions. Okay? So, Molinism is more like theistic determinism than it is like process theism. All right? It's because of its meticulous view of divine providence. So I think the Molinist is going to run into the same kind of objection I raised about promoting moral skepticism, because the Molinist has got to say everything that ever happened, every evil, every moral, every sin was specifically ordained by God as part of this complete package. This entire history that God decreed that feasible world, that complete history for some greater good that we really can't wrap our minds around. Which means that every instance of moral evil is compatible with the good as God understands the good. Yet, I think, speaking for me, and I think a lot of Christians have this view that moral evil is just plain incompatible with the good.
Yeah.
That's what I want to say, at any rate. And so it seems to me that if the Molinism is right, then we've got this sort of fundamental moral intuition that the Molinist has to say, that's wrong. You're wrong about that. What you think is incompatible with the good is in fact compatible with the good. And so you're wrong in this fundamental moral conviction of yours. And to my mind, that pushes towards moral skepticism. There's also, in the paper, I raise another problem for Molinism that, to my knowledge, Molinists have not discussed. I of course haven't read all of the latest Molinist literature, but I've read a fair amount of it over the years. And one of the things Molinists do to try to get God off the hook for, why did God ordain these evils and stuff, is they'll invoke middle knowledge, and they'll say, they'll like blame the counterfactuals. We talked about all this information that was available to God as part of his middle knowledge before he decided to create, that's independent of God and constrains his options. Right? So a lot of Molinists will say, well, could God have gotten a world in which nobody ever sinned? Well, you might theoretically think so. There's a possible world out there, but there's no feasible world, or arguably is no feasible world, because perhaps every possible free creature that God could have created and put in a free choice situation would have freely sinned. And they even have given a label to this idea. They call it trans-world depravity. It's kind of like total depravity, except it's got this modal aspect to it. But
Way more people.
yeah. Now, what I want to say to that, I want to say, one, the hypothesis of trans-world depravity was something that Alvin Plantinga proposed in the context of responding to the logical problem of evil, which was this problem that attempt to show that there's a logical contradiction between saying God exists and is all is perfectly good, perfectly knowing, perfectly omnipotent, and evil of any sort exists. And the Plantinga, he's a Molinist, and so he's assuming God's got this middle knowledge, and he's saying, well, why would God create a world that's got this evil if he could have avoided it and knew he could have avoided it? Well, perhaps he didn't know he could have avoided it. Perhaps he couldn't have, because these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, there just was no scenario in which evil didn't eventually enter the system. And so God then picks the best feasible world of the options he has available to him, and which may be far worse than this sort of ideal world, but it's the best God could do with the middle knowledge that he had. What I want to say to that, and again, here's the problem that Molinists haven't really thought about, is this idea of trans-world depravity. While it may be logically possible, it is massively implausible. Okay, especially if you imagine, as I think most Molinists do, that there is a virtually infinite number of possible free creatures that he could have created. Well, okay, so suppose it's true, and suppose God knew this from before the sun created, that if he created Adam and Eve and put them in the Garden of Eden with this scenario, where they're tempted in a certain way, that they would freely rebel. Okay, knowing that, why couldn't he find another pair of possible creatures? Say Maria and Jose, and put them as the first two humans, knowing on the basis of infinite knowledge that they would freely choose to resist the temptation and obey God. Okay, well, maybe you say, okay, but those two wouldn't. Well, how about the next pair, or the next pair, or the next pair, or the next pair? If you've got a virtually infinite number of possible free creatures to work with, it is exceedingly implausible that every single one would make the same choice that Adam and Eve would. And if it were true that everyone would do that, then it seems almost, how is that scenario still free in a libertarian sense? How are they really free to do otherwise? Right?
Right.
If every possible creature in that circumstance is going to respond in roughly the same way and choose moral evil over goodness, that doesn't look to me like a genuinely free scenario anymore. Whereas if it is a genuinely free scenario, it looks really implausible that God wouldn't have had available some combination of possible creatures and scenarios that he could build, where he could have gotten a world with no moral evil at all, or at the very least, much, much less moral evil. Again, if you have an infinite number of possible free creatures to play with, all these creaturely essences that
one would assume that there would be a combination somewhere in that infinitesimal amount that would not fall.
Yeah. So I think for this blaming the counterfactuals to do any real work, the Molinist needs there to be a relatively small, finite number of possible creatures. It's still implausible that anything like trans-world depravity would be true if you have, say, enough possible free creatures to populate the Earth as the actual human history. You need tens of billions probably. but it's it's at least more plausible than if you're talking about an infinite number of possible free creatures. Um, and so for blaming the counterfactuals to do any real work for the Molinists, I think they have to greatly limit the range of possible free creatures. But then, if they're going to do that, then they need to tell us a metaphysical story about why the number should be so small. And I don't think any Molinist has taken up that topic.
Mm.
It's to my knowledge, again, there's a lot of literature I haven't read, but I have looked at a fair amount of the prominent Molinist stuff, at least, like Tom Flint and Bill Craig and stuff, and to my knowledge, they don't bring up the issue at all. So that's a gap, I think, in Molinist response to the problem of evil, and I encourage Molinists to take that on seriously, and not just make these what seem to me to be incredibly implausible appeals to trans-world depravity and stuff like that. That may give you some mileage if you're rebutting the logical problem of evil, but when you're dealing with what's known as the evidential problem of evil, that doesn't get you very far at all, because there you've got to argue that your model is more plausible than the alternative. You can't just say that, well, it's possible. That's not good enough. Okay, so that's, I think, the main issues Molinism is going to face retrospectively. Again, God's role in the coming to be of evil. Forward-looking, I think Molinists are in a much improved position with respect to process theists. God, on their view, is fully omnipotent and can unilaterally bring things about. So, God can, put a final end to evil. God can bring the world to an eternal state where evil is fully vanquished. It may involve having to annihilate a bunch of people to fully get rid of that, but God can decisively, put an end to it, and can, by his, because he has a high degree of influence over events, can bring a lot of good out of the evils that have happened. So God can redeem a lot of evils, and God can finally defeat it. In that respect, I think their position is not quite as good as the Theistic Determinist, but it's a big improvement over the process theist.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas retrospectively, why did God allow this to happen in the first place? I think the Molinist is a little bit better than the Theistic Determinist, but not much better. Again, because God is meticulously decreeing everything that ever happens, and that includes every moral evil. The Open Theist. Can I move to that now?
Yes, please. I'm curious to see your take on this.
All right. So Open Theism, again, it's kind of an in-between view. It's in between determinism and process theism, but it's going to be a little closer to the process side of the spectrum there. So, in contrast to Molinism and Theistic Determinism, the Open Theist has a general view of divine providence. And so God does not specifically ordain everything that comes to pass. And what I would argue is that the best version of Open Theism is going to say that one of the things God does not ordain, does not specifically decree, is any moral evil. So on this version, every sin is, from God's perspective, is tragic. It is the world would have been better had those sins not occurred. Sin was never a necessary part of God's eternal plan. God, of course, prepared for it. He had contingency plans in place. If Adam and Eve rebel, then okay, we're going to have a process of salvation ready to go. A plan for that. God's not caught flat-footed. human rebellion. But it was never the divine intent. It was never something that God ordained from the get-go. And so the open theist, unlike the Molinist and the Theistic Determinist, the open theist can say, with respect to moral evils in particular, that God merely permits them. Right? God didn't ordain it. God didn't cause it. But he did allow it for some greater good. And here one can appeal to like the free will theodicy or the soul-making theodicy or any other number of theodicies to try to sell this idea that God has good reasons for allowing people to misuse their freedom in this way and not stepping in to prevent it. Okay. So that's the general line the open theist is going to take. The process person is going to step in and say, hey, but still God could have prevented it on your view. And so you got some explaining to do. And I'll say, yeah, you're right about that. The open theist does have some explaining to do. But we don't have to say with respect to any moral evil that God specifically decreed, caused, or ordained it to happen. We can consistently say, unlike Molinism and Theistic Determinism, that God merely permits moral evil. And I think that leaves the open theist in a better position than either of those two views to deal with the retrospective problem of evil.
Right. And we can actually utilize those various theodicies consistently with our view of God. Because
exactly. And we're not in danger of encouraging moral skepticism in the way that Molinism and Theistic Determinism are, because there's no inconsistency between saying God permits whatever evils he permits for a greater good, and saying that moral evil is incompatible with the good, because what God is permitting it, what God is willing is not the actuality of the moral evil, but merely the possibility of it. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas on say like the Molinist view, God, in decreeing this particular feasible world with all of the specific evils it contains, God is in some sense is willing every instance of moral evil. He's not merely willing its possibility, he's willing its actuality as part of that big picture.
Right.
So the open theist, I think, is in a better position with respect to the retrospective problem of evil than either Molinism or Theistic Determinism. In the forward-looking direction, I think they're in pretty much the same position as the Molinist is. They're not going to have as easy a time of it as the determinists, because God's larger goals involve working around creaturely freedom. God can't just ride roughshod over that or program us to do, to act the way he wants us to. But he does have a lot more control over things than the process you would have it. So that's kind of how I size things up. I think retrospectively, again, dealing with the coming about of evils, I think the process camp is in the best position, but they're also in the worst position with respect, when we're thinking prospectively, when we're looking forward. God can't ever really get rid of evil. The Theistic Determinist is in the best position looking forward, but the worst position looking backwards, and God's role in the coming to be of evils. The Molinist and the Open Theist are somewhere in between. The Molinist is a little bit better than the Theistic Determinist with respect to the retrospective, the coming about of evils, because they can say, well, God didn't cause it all, right? God gives his creatures real freedom, like libertarian freedom, and so it's the creatures who are ultimately to blame for moral evil. But God is still on the hook for ordaining a world that contained all those evils. And so God doesn't merely permit moral evil, he specifically ordains every instance. And given the mechanics of Molinism, it seems rather implausible that God wouldn't have been able to ordain a feasible world with a vastly less evil in it and vastly more good. So
And it seems like in the theistic determinist and the Molinist camp, evil is a pre-creation fact. It's a certainty, it's an inevitability, whereas in the open position or in the process, it's a potential.
yeah,
That's a fair assessment.
Well, I suppose we're going to say it's a kind of a necessary pre-creation fact. I mean, I'm not sure I would say that, because both the theist determinists and Molinists would say God, if God is free at all, God has the option not to create.
Mm-hmm.
And so there could be just God and God alone, and God is perfectly good, and so you've got no evil. So, but they would have to say that God willed, in some sense, every evil that ever occurs for some great good that God has in mind. For the, again, that we really haven't any real clear grasp on. They can talk about, well, for the greater glory of God, but it's really not clear how any of, how it leads to God's glory, or why God didn't already have all the glory he needed to begin with. And so,
right.
Yeah, so, in the forward-looking direction, I think, again, the theist determinist is going to be in the best shape. Molinist and the open theist at about the same point, somewhere in the middle, not quite, in the sense that God has the power to unilaterally bring things about, and to put an end to evil, and to cast the devil into the lake of fire and annihilate that if he wants.
Mm-hmm.
But he's constrained in some ways by his own choices. God creates these free creatures. He wants them to freely choose them. So if God's goals for creation involve having these free creatures, well, in order to respect his own goals, he's got to respect that freedom. Which means he can't intervene excessively or too much. He's got to kind of stay his hand and not prevent everything he could have prevented. So anyway, that's
I think that's a very helpful. I think that's a very helpful overview, and I like the way that you break it down with retrospective and prospective, because often there gets we tend to talk over each other without that sort of nuance, or we'll miss some of the strengths and weaknesses of the different positions. So it's a very interesting way of contrasting and comparing these. So I really do like that. And so, do you have any final thoughts on this before I look at the comments and see if we have any questions? And if you do have questions, make sure you guys post those with a big giant Q or some way that you can identify those, so that I know you want me to ask Dr. Rhoda here. But do you have anything else you'd like to add? Any sort of final points before we go to the questions?
No, I don't really. I mean, no, I'm happy. I think I said enough. So
I think it was very helpful. And I like I said, I really have enjoyed this. Let me scroll through the comments here just real quickly. We've got a comment here from Christopher Geary. Says it's a cool topic, and the problem of evil is basically a non-starter for the determinist. Let me look through here. Kent Smith asks where he can get the Idol Killer countdown intro, and that's a unique edit just for this program. I'm sorry, that's not available anywhere. You have to tune in and listen, or watch my YouTube videos to get that. Looking here through the comments here, I know I've seen a few questions here marked with a Q. There's a lot of somewhat side chat that was a little bit unrelated here. see. Future Not Fixed. Genesis 1:1 and Revelation 22:21 and everything in between teach open theism. Says here, micromanaging is not relational, it's puppetry. And encourages us to rock on. Thank you so much, Future Not Fixed. Let's see. God does permit evil. He prohibits it. We, creatures, permit evil. We are responsible for permitting evil by our choices. Also
I'm not sure I would entirely agree with that. I mean, it seems to me that, at least on an open theistic model, and again, if we're talking about, well, it depends on what kind of evil we're talking about here, right? We're talking about sort of evil in general, where that includes any kind of suffering, pain, like pain in your toe. Well, I mean, in that case, I mean, God actually inflicts evil in some cases in the Bible. God smites, like that guy who reached out to touch the Ark of the Covenant. And at least on some eschatologies, God is going to, inflict a lot of suffering on people in after the final judgment. So if you're talking about evil in that sense, like every view other than the process view is going to say, there's some kinds of evil that God not only merely permits but actually causes. The real point where the views start to divide with respect to moral evil, or what we might call human sin. And there, I would want to say, yeah, I mean, at least on the open view, God does sort of merely permit it, in the sense that God has the power, like if he saw Adam and Eve, and he's observing the devil tempting them, he could step in and kind of rewire their brains or something. He could do something to maybe distract them or something at that moment, right? Or now in so doing, he would be sort of taking over their agency.
The way I see that, and I've described it, is if God intervened and stopped Adam and Eve from making that choice, he essentially would be doing the devil's work himself, because he would be marring his own image rather than leaving that image bearer to be free and self-determinative, which was his ultimate purpose there. And so God did not want to mar his own image. He allowed man to do that and then chose to redeem it.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, I think it's certainly true that we creatures, we permit evil. In fact, sometimes as parents, if you have kids, you may decide, like your kids are having a fight of some sort, you may decide for a time to not step in and prevent one kid from, say, hitting the other. But if you're watching a situation, you'll step in if it gets too far, but you might refrain from stepping in up to a certain point, and allow them to inflict certain, engage in certain kinds of moral evils, because you don't want to micromanage them, right? Because you don't want to be a helicopter parent, right? You want them to learn how to negotiate these disagreements for themselves and things like that.
Yeah.
So God might, well have very good reasons for not stepping in and, preventing everything that he could have prevented. And in that sense, I think he could be said he permits it. Not that he wills it necessarily, because, allowing something to happen is just kind of willing the possibility of it. It's not necessarily willing the actuality of it.
Yeah, makes sense. And then Hudson TD 777 says, would you guys agree with Henry Moore on his theory of time? And I'm not familiar with Henry Moore. Are you?
Nope, I am not. I know a lot about the metaphysics of time and those debates, but not Henry Moore is a name that doesn't ring a bell.
No, I'll look that up after the program and try and do a little bit of digging into it. But that's a good question. I appreciate you bringing that work to my attention. I find time as a fascinating subject, and one that kind of relates to everything that we're talking about here. Future Not Fixed says process seems similar to Molinism in that Molinism, God is subject to counterfactuals. I think he was responding to.
Yeah, like there is a similarity there in the sense that both the Molinist and the process theist believe that God's initial creative options are constrained by contingent facts, right? So in the process view, what God can do is always constrained by the previous state of the world process, and that's something that's contingent, but God's always in medias res. He's there's he's got to deal with the contingency of history as it's handed to him. In the Molinist view, God's always got to deal with the contingency of his middle knowledge. It's this information, again, that doesn't come from God's nature, doesn't come from creation. It's seemingly just brute. It's just there and somehow constrains what an omnipotent God can do, which seems just utterly bizarre to me, but that's Molinism for you.
We got another comment here from Japheth. He says he's an open theist and he thinks the process theist creator is not worthy of worship. And that's an interesting topic that's often brought up into these, is which conception is worthy of worship. That's an interesting parallel. But I see a lot of theistic determinists lumping open theism in with process theism and trying to make them almost indistinguishable from one another, while those in both camps are going, oh no, we're like, there's areas where we agree, but no, not that much,
The main issues that are going to divide the open theist and the process theist is the open theist has a much more classical view of God's power.
Yeah.
So the open theist is going to say God creates ex nihilo, that there kind of is this moment when there's God and God alone, and then there is God and creation, and it is God who brings about at least the initial state of creation.
Then you've got the Christological issues that we addressed, and things that they handle there that are going to be another potential divide between the camps.
Yeah.
And Japheth goes on, he says, if one has a framework which denies exhaustive determinism, then it's necessary for God to have coercive power to actualize prophecies. So, yeah, you said moving forward, the process theism, he can't coerce. So how does he persuade prophecy? That's a very interesting point that Japheth
I'm not sure he's talking about process theism there, but certainly, yeah. If you deny exhaustive determinism, then if God's going to reveal like a specific prophecy, at this future date this shall happen, then it would seem that you would need a kind of maybe a local determinism, a non-exhaustive determinism, in order for God to guarantee that specific result, right? So you could have a view like Molinists and open theists think God determines some things, but not all things, right? God set up unilaterally the initial state of the universe, right? Big Bang or whatever that was. God unilaterally set up the laws of nature, whatever those are exactly, right? God, so there are things that God just does, and that's how it is. And then God decides how much leeway he's going to build into the system. Do we have a pervasive kind of leeway? Like at the quantum level, there's all this indeterminism happening on. Maybe, and then God kind of nudges or manages things maybe in hidden ways along the way, but or is the range of creaturely freedom very tightly constrained, or is it, again, like the process view, wide open? You can have any kind of position in that whole spectrum there, from God determines everything but this one event. To God determines virtually nothing except maybe the initial state of creation. So there's a lot of room to play with the variables there.
We've got another one here from 8010 as a question. What do you think about compatibilism? I feel like it's an appeal to mystery to cover up a contradiction. When do you think appeals to mystery are justified?
I mentioned by compatibilism here, we're talking about like free will being compatible with determinism.
I'm sure it's like theistic determinism that says that God can determine everything and we're still held responsible or accountable.
Yeah. So my intuition there is I'm a libertarian. I'm an incompatibilist with respect to free will and moral responsibility. And I don't think they're compatible with determinism. And my main reason for thinking that is because of what seems to me to be kind of the sourcehood constraint or intuition on creaturely freedom. I think if creatures are to be genuinely free and responsible for their choices, that at some point they must be a kind of an ultimate source of their own decisions. Like a buck stopping source.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really up to me to do this or this, and I am the final arbiter as to which way I go. If you have any form of determinism, there's going to be a backward chain of causes that's going to necessitate which way you go. And maybe it runs through your psychology in a sort of, in a way to which you still feel like you're free, but you're not really free. And it seems to me that then you're not really responsible, because it's sort of just as if nature or God or, powers that be have kind of set you up at that point to make the exact choice you do make.
It seems like theistic determinism runs into much of the same defeaters as naturalistic. So it's just, seems like there needs to be a strong intuition that we are the ones that are truly making the choice, free to make it, free to do contrary, and thus we're responsible.
If you have theistic determinism, it seems to me that we all get a kind of ironclad excuse for our behavior. It says, well, ultimately God made me do it.
Yeah.
I couldn't have done otherwise. And it seems to me in that case that you've got a perfect moral excuse.
It's like that old line, the devil made me do it, but the devil's going, no, God made us do that.
So as far as appeals to mystery, I think they're fine when it's merely an acknowledgement of the limits of our understanding and our ignorance. It's God is so vast, his understanding, like the universe is so vast, so complex, and I mean, how can we think with our very small, limited experience of things and our brains that move at a very slow speed, compared to, the infinite, thoughts of God, that we can see the big picture, and see it accurately. So when it's just a matter of things that are plausibly matters of just our ignorance due to our limitations, I think appeals to mystery are just fine.
Yeah,
and perhaps
everybody's
even
going
to
to run into some point where they just go, I just don't know.
yeah, and perhaps even to be encouraged, to respect that there is a mystery there that we should not expect to be able to figure it all out. Where I think appeals to mystery are bad is when you've got an apparent contradiction, when you've got a theoretical tension there, and you're trying to just get out of it by just saying, well, let's just appeal to mystery. I think that's not just responding to kind of, you know, our apparent ignorance of how things work, but you're basically using mystery to shut off your own mind here. You're refusing to engage with this tension here, and you're saying, I'm just going to ignore it and kind of like the ostrich, put your head in the sand. I'm not going to think about that. And that just strikes me as intellectually dishonest.
Yeah.
And so,
We've got another question here for you. Now, this one's going to get into some heavy philosophical wranglings, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. What are your thoughts on the so-called Frankfurt cases and sourcehood libertarianism? It seems like rejecting PAP means you reject libertarian free will. I can't, for the life of me, figure out how it would work.
all right, I'll give you my take on that. I'm not persuaded by Frankfurt cases. I think, I mean, of course, there are lots of different Frankfurt cases, and so a response that works for one of them may not work for all of them and stuff. But the general response that I think works against the initial types of cases that Frankfurt himself proposed, and I think can probably be adapted for a lot of the newer fangled cases, is called the indeterministic world objection or the Kane-Werdecker objection. Um, uh, and it's simply this, that if indeterminism is right, and if we are free in the libertarian sense of freedom, then there's, well, in the Frankfurt type of scenario, at least the original scenario, if you have this counterfactual intervener who is monitoring a person's brain states to see if they're about to make a certain choice. And if they're about to make that choice, then, and it's a choice the intervener wants them to make, then the intervener does nothing, right? But if they're about to make the choice the other way, then the intervener kind of flips the switch and kind of makes them do the choice the intervener wants. And so the idea is that you can, if you do the choice that the intervener wants you to make without the intervener having to actually intervene, then you're responsible for that, but you didn't have an alternative because the intervener would have prevented you from doing otherwise. And I want to say, if the libertarian view of freedom is right, then there isn't anything that this intervener could monitor in your brain or elsewhere prior to your choice to be certain what you're about to do, right? There is no determinate fact of the matter as to what you're going to choose until you actually choose.
Right. It's assuming an input-output mechanism similar to like a punch card or a computer.
Yeah.
And we're saying, no, that doesn't exist within God's image bearers.
Yeah. So what the intervener would have to do here is they would have to kind of roll the dice and say, well, either I'm going to just hope for the best and hope that they make the choice I wanted without actually intervening. But then the person had alternative possibilities all along the way on the libertarian construal. On the other hand, they can say, I don't want to take that risk. I really need them to make this choice that I want them to make. So I got to preempt their choice and intervene ahead of time. Okay, well, then they had no alternatives, but they weren't free. So either way, it seems to me this kind of scenario doesn't work. As far as sourcehood libertarians, I agree with the sourcehood intuition. I think ultimately, to be free, you've got to, in some sense, be the kind of the ultimate source of your choices. But it seems to me, and this is also argued by libertarians such as Robert Kane and others, he would argue that sourcehood entails alternative possibilities. because if there were no alternatives, if you really are the source of your choice, then it's going to be sort of up to you how you go at that point, right? And so you're going to have some kind of alternatives. And so he thinks you can derive PAP from the sourcehood condition. Now, of course, yes, there are people who think all you need is the sourcehood. I think that's. I tend to think of merely sourcehood libertarians, one who rejects PAP, as really not being libertarians at all. They might protest at that point, but I have a hard time understanding how you can really get the sourcehood and the sort of incompatibilism without having alternative possibilities. I guess you would need to tell a story about some sort of hypothetical intervener, to give some Frankfurt scenario that's going to be resilient to rebuttals, like the indeterministic world objection. And I haven't seen any that seem to me to be resilient to those rebuttals. But anyway.
Well, guys, I think we've stolen enough time from Mr. Rhoda's family. We need to return him back to those who care for him. But thank you so much, sir, for joining us. Thank you for your work in this paper and for explaining it to us. Thank you for taking the time to answer these questions and being thoughtful and reasoned and trying to be fair in this. I really got a sense from the paper that you were really being fair, and you're saying here, this view is strong here and really weak here, moderately here, strong there, weak here, moderate. It seemed to be very fair and even-handed. And I'll do my best to put a link to that in the video description. But would you like to leave us with any parting words or anything like that before we bid you farewell, sir?
Well, I'll give just a couple things. I'll express my thanks to you for this opportunity. I will say that the paper, if you're linking to it, it is a draft. It's a slightly revised version of a paper that I wrote for a book on the problem of evil that is being published in Swedish.
Oh, well then I can hold off on putting that link if you'd prefer.
Yeah. The paper is going to be published in Swedish, so it's getting translated. It was written for I was asked to write it for a like a beginning undergraduate audience. So I did deliberately kind of enter the topic slowly and try to set things up, and to be accessible. I would say I'll give you a version of the paper which you can link to. Okay.
We'll work something out. We'll work something out soon.
Yeah.
We won't put too much pressure on you.
Yeah.
We'll work something out soon that we can link to. And
yeah, I'm still trying to get it published in a mainstream journal, but I'm going to have to probably rework the paper a bit because it's a bit long as it stands, and it because the original was written for kind of to be very accessible. It's what journals are looking for is they want something that's cutting edge. And so I'm going to have to kind of cut out a lot of the more introductory stuff and get right to the more controversial cutting edge stuff if I want to get this published. So
well, then we'll work something out. We'll work something out with Dr. Rhoda to get something out there for you guys. In the meantime, I hope that you've all enjoyed this. Bilbo, thank you so much for the super chat. That was a great way to end the program. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate the encouragement. And I guess with that, sir, we will bid you adieu. Thank you so much for tuning into Idol Killer. Thank you, sir, for sharing your thoughts and research and all of this. Everyone remember that God loves you, and we do too. Take care.
The only way to get there was to float through the terrifying void between us. A chilly sense of